The infirmary lights stayed on all night. No prisoners were treated. By morning, one name no longer existed in the records, and no one asked why it was hers. The order arrived after midnight. No stamp, no signature, only instructions. In a German POW camp where every action followed rigid procedure, this message ignored all of it. It did not come through medical command. It did not involve wounded prisoners. Yet it demanded the presence of the camp's female doctor. She read it twice, then a third time. What she was being asked to oversee violated camp regulations, rules the Germans enforced without exception. Rules designed to protect order, hierarchy, and distance. It should not have been assigned to her. But the message made something clear without saying it directly. This was not a request. And refusing was not mentioned, because refusal was not expected. She gathered her coat in silence, already sensing that compliance would not end the matter. Only begin it. The walk back from the infirmary felt longer than it should have. Not because of distance, but because of silence. The camp had a rhythm she knew by heart. Boots on gravel. Metal doors. Orders shouted, then obeyed. That rhythm was gone. Guards stood where they didn't usually stand. Others avoided the corridor entirely. No one spoke to her directly anymore. Instructions were passed along, indirectly, as if proximity itself carried risk. She replayed the order in her mind, not the words, but the absence of explanation. Doctors were trained to ask questions. This time, none were allowed. What unsettled her most was not fear of punishment. It was the realization that whatever she had been brought into had already been decided. Her role was not to judge, not to prevent, only to be present. Inside the infirmary, she moved slowly, checked instruments she did not need, adjusted records she would not use. The delay felt deliberate, as if time itself was testing her willingness to continue. She thought of the oath she had taken, then of the uniform she wore. Both demanded obedience. Only one demanded silence. And silence, she realized, was the heavier burden. Because once she accepted it, truly accepted it, there would be no moment later where she could claim ignorance. This was not a test of courage. It was a test of complicity. And the most disturbing part was how easily the camp made that choice feel normal. The camp did not change all at once. That would have been noticeable. Questioned. Corrected. Instead, it changed in fragments. The first morning after the order, the doctor noticed that roll call took longer, not because prisoners were missing, but because the count was repeated. Once, then again. The officer in charge erased his chalk marks and rewrote them with slightly heavier pressure. No explanation followed. Breakfast was served 10 minutes late. No announcement was made. Guards shifted positions without being instructed. One corridor remained closed longer than usual, then reopened as if nothing had happened. To anyone else, these details meant nothing. To her, they felt intentional. The infirmary opened on time, but only 3 patients arrived instead of the usual dozen. One asked a question she had never been asked before. Another left without completing treatment. She marked the records carefully. Later that day, she realized the forms had already been altered. Not erased. Adjusted. Handwriting similar to hers, but not identical. She said nothing. Because the most unsettling part was not the changes themselves. It was how everyone behaved, as if the changes had always been there. That night the sound returned. Not loud. Not alarming. Just present. A brief metallic shift, then silence so complete it felt deliberate. She waited for voices. Orders. Movement. Nothing followed. The camp resumed its rhythm the next morning, almost. Days passed. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was the problem. Paperwork increased without reason. Medical logs referenced procedures she had not performed. Dates skipped forward, then backward. A patient appeared twice in the same week with identical notes, except the second entry had no signature. When she asked about it, a clerk shrugged. Probably a clerical delay. But delays created gaps. These records were complete, just incorrect. She began to notice that guards avoided standing near the infirmary after dusk, not ordered away, not reassigned. They simply chose distance. One evening, a junior officer entered the building, stopped at the doorway and hesitated. He did not step inside. He left without explanation. The doctor remained alone. Time began to behave strangely. Hours passed without markers. Meals arrived early or late. Lights stayed on longer than necessary. The camp clock remained correct, but nothing aligned with it anymore. She stopped asking questions, not because she feared answers, but because she understood that answers were no longer the point. The system was no longer reacting to events. It was maintaining a version of reality, and she was now inside it. It always happened at the same hour, just after the final inspection. A sound or the absence of one. A moment when the camp felt hollow. She could not describe it precisely, and that made it worse. Not footsteps, not machinery, not voices. Just a brief shift, as if space itself had adjusted. Then nothing. The first time she dismissed it. The second time, she noticed the guard outside her quarters had changed. The third time, she realized no one reacted. No pause. No acknowledgement. The repetition began to feel like a test. Not of patience, of acceptance. She stopped writing during that hour, stopped moving. Even breathing felt louder than it should have been. The camp had learned how to hold its breath. One morning, a name was missing from the medical registry. Not crossed out. Not erased. Simply absent. The index jumped from one entry to the next, as if the missing name had never existed. She checked older copies. The name was gone there too. When she asked for the file, she was told it had never been created. Later that day, she found a coat hanging where it did not belong. No one claimed it. By evening it was gone. The infirmary instruments were rearranged, not randomly, but deliberately. Tools she rarely used were placed closest to hand. Others were moved just out of reach. She did not move them back, because by now she understood. The camp was no longer enforcing rules. It was enforcing continuity. Weeks passed. The abnormal became routine. Silence stopped feeling heavy. It became structural, like walls or fences. When a guard finally spoke directly to her, the interaction felt unnatural, almost intrusive. She realized something had shifted inside her. Not fear. Not guilt. Expectation. She no longer waited for explanations. She waited for alignment, for the camp to feel balanced again. And that realization disturbed her more than anything else, because it meant the system had succeeded. It had not needed violence, or threats, or declarations. Only repetition, only silence, only time. Nothing exploded. No secret was revealed. No truth emerged. But by the end of that period, one thing was certain. Whatever the camp had broken that night, it was no longer trying to fix. And neither, she realized, was she. Nothing happened the next day. That was the first consequence. No inquiry. No confrontation. No correction of procedure. The camp did not react the way systems usually react to violations. There was no tightening of rules, no visible punishment. Instead, everything continued, which meant whatever had occurred was no longer considered an event. It had already been absorbed. The doctor noticed the changes in the only place truth was supposed to remain stable. Paper. Medical records that once followed strict formatting now varied subtly. Margins changed. Ink density differed. Dates aligned imperfectly. Nothing obvious enough to challenge, but enough to unsettle anyone paying attention. Some patients appeared healthier on paper than in person. Others vanished from logs entirely, despite having been treated days earlier. She searched for consistency. There was none. When she asked the records officer about missing entries, he did not deny their absence. He simply said, "If it's not written, it didn't happen." The statement was not threatening. It was procedural. That was when she understood. The camp was no longer documenting reality. It was curating memory. An inspection team arrived weeks later. They toured the barracks, checked inventories, reviewed medical facilities. Everything appeared in order, because everything that wasn't in order had already been removed. Questions were asked, but only the right ones. Answers were given, but only from approved material. No one mentioned the night. No one referenced the irregular order. No discrepancies were acknowledged. The doctor stood nearby during the inspection, silent. Not because she was ordered to be, but because she was no longer sure which version of events would be considered real. Silence had become safer than accuracy. Some staff began behaving differently. A nurse who once spoke freely stopped speaking at all. A guard requested reassignment without explanation. Another officer transferred suddenly, leaving no forwarding record. No one said they were connected. But patterns don't need confirmation to be understood. The camp didn't remove everyone. Only those who remembered too clearly. Those who hesitated when asked routine questions. Those who paused before answering. Memory itself had become a liability. The infirmary changed in ways that could not be logged. It felt smaller. Not physically, psychologically. Conversations ended quickly. Eyes lowered. Patients answered questions carefully, as if unsure which details were permitted. Medical decisions were still made, but the reasons behind them were no longer discussed. The doctor realized the hospital had stopped being a place of care. It had become a place of containment. Not of bodies, of knowledge. Nothing dramatic marked the erasure. No arrests. No trials. No accusations. Names simply stopped appearing. Assignments shifted. Rooms were reassigned. Responsibilities redistributed. People who had been present were now described as having always been elsewhere. And because documentation supported this version, it became true. Reality adjusted itself to match the paperwork. The system didn't destroy evidence. It replaced it. The doctor eventually noticed something worse than missing records. Her own handwriting had changed. Not consciously. Not intentionally. She had begun leaving things out. Not lies. Just omissions. Details that required explanation were no longer written. Events without witnesses were summarized vaguely. She told herself it was efficiency. But deep down she knew better. She was adapting. Because survival no longer depended on what you knew. It depended on what you chose not to record. Months passed. The camp functioned smoothly. New prisoners arrived. Old routines returned. The system stabilized. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. Which was the final consequence? The system did not collapse under its violation. It improved. It learned how to remove friction, how to eliminate uncertainty, how to erase without disruption. No apology was issued, no correction made, no truth restored. The night became something else. Not a secret, not a scandal, just a gap. And gaps, the camp had learned, were easy to live with. The camp did not remember the night, at least not officially. No files carried dates that aligned with it. No reports referenced it. No officer, past or present, wrote a line that could anchor its existence in records. If someone had searched for proof, they would have found nothing solid enough to point at. Nothing tangible. Only continuity. Only normality. The kind of normality that convinces everyone it had always been there. The kind that erases questions before they are asked. The doctor remained at her post. She treated patients with the same precision she always had. She filled out forms with the same care. She followed procedures that looked identical to those of the past months, years even. But something fundamental had shifted. Not in the camp. Not in the buildings. Not in the papers that lined the shelves. It had shifted in how she understood responsibility. She realized that rules do not vanish in a single night. They thin. They fade at the edges. They become habits performed without thought, without belief. One day you do not break rules. You do not notice the absence of them. You only continue. And that was the most disturbing realization. The camp had adapted. Everyone adapted. No outrage came. No rebellion. No questioning glances passed between staff. No whispered conversations. Only quiet adjustment. The system did not ask anyone to agree with what happened. It only asked them to continue. And they did. The doctor sometimes wondered whether refusal, that night, would have changed anything. Whether absence would have mattered more than presence. Whether a single act of defiance could have altered the sequence of silence and compliance. But the question arrived too late. Time had moved forward. Paths not taken were invisible. History does not record them. All that remained were outcomes. The ones people learned to live with. The war would continue outside the fences. The camp would eventually close, its doors locked or torn down. Files would be archived, misplaced, destroyed, or shredded for unrelated reasons. And yet something remained. Not evidence, not proof, not even memory, but precedent. The precedent was simple. When rules become inconvenient, they can be set aside. Not loudly, not proudly, but efficiently. And once this happens, the most dangerous thing is not cruelty, not punishment, not overt injustice. It is how ordinary it feels afterward. The doctor walked the corridors alone. She observed, but did not intervene unless required. She treated patients, took notes, recorded observations, but always under the weight of an invisible truth. What had occurred was no longer spoken of. It lingered in silence, not as a story, not as memory, but as expectation. The night did not haunt the camp. It haunted the silence that followed. And silence, once accepted, rarely needs enforcement. It does not demand reminders. It only requires participants willing to look away. Those who remain continue as if nothing essential had been lost. As she filed her final reports, the doctor realized that compliance and survival are rarely the same. Sometimes survival requires forgetting. Sometimes it requires adaptation to circumstances that never should have existed. She left the infirmary at dusk. The beds behind her were empty, the tools neatly arranged, the building quiet. Outside, the camp seemed unchanged, orderly, efficient, normal. And yet she could feel the weight of the absent night pressing on every shadow, every empty corner, every unasked question. Because some truths do not vanish completely. They linger where nobody is looking. They echo in the pauses between actions. They settle in the quiet spaces left behind by obedience. And in those pauses, in those echoes, the story waits. Waiting for someone to remember. Waiting for someone to ask. But most walk past, eyes down, pretending nothing essential has been lost. And so the night, though erased from record, survives in silence.